for coming. If you haven't taken a moment to fill out the form or just log on to the Today's Meet, you can do that. It looks like we have a nice variety of people in the audience. We have anywhere from people working in higher ed with pre-service teachers to school administrators, lots of classroom teachers. So hopefully a lot of the real-world application and examples I'm going to talk about today will resonate with you. And so I'm going to get started. Welcome to iPad Instructional Strategies and Content Creation Apps. I'm Caroline Habig. I'm an Instructional Technology Coordinator in Lincolnshire, Illinois. We're actually a 912 district, but I have a lot of friends and colleagues that I work with who work across all different grade levels. And before I took my current position 2.5 years ago, I taught high school social studies in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So that's also the background I come from. We currently are a one-to-one iPad district, so all of our 4,000 students have iPads that we provide them. But I also work with a lot of schools and teachers that have varying degrees of access. And let me tell you, there's a lot of amazing things you can do even with the slightest bit of access. Whether it has to do with access to iPads and or internet. There's a lot of really, I think, great opportunities for learners out there, and how we as educators can be savvy in terms of how we maximize what we have instead of worrying about what we don't have. So I think that's a really big thing to think about. So the 5 big things I'm going to talk about today. 1, why metacognition? So getting kids to think about their own thinking and learning. Why do that? And more specifically, what does deeper reflection and visible thinking look like with the iPad, okay? And then how to do it, so how we're doing it. And also from looking at the form people filled out, I see that we have a wide variety of how people are accessing iPads and creation content apps today. And I'm going to talk about tools for assessment and curating student content. I think a lot of times when teachers are doing great things with technology and their kids are producing, sometimes we're so exhausted by it getting to the point of how do we give kids targeted feedback? What do we do with the projects once they're created? I think that's an important piece that sometimes is easy to forget. So curating. So I would actually like to start with an activity where I'm going to give you a minute to think about, talk to maybe someone next to you, and put your answer in the Today's Meet of how are your students learning now? And notice that it doesn't say what are your students learning now. Sometimes people read this as what are your students learning now, but we're really looking at how, because that's going to be a big part of how we're looking at using technology. How do we support learning environments that really help learners? And if you need some other things to kind of get your conversation going, I mean, feel free to look at those other questions. So in the Today's Meet and or talking to someone next to you, I like the Today's Meet because then we can all kind of see what everyone's thinking. How are your students learning now? And if you need the link, it's todaysmeet.com/Habig, FETC. Designing tasks. And 10 more seconds, and then I'm going to move on. Thank you for doing that. I think it's always interesting to see how people respond to that question, as well as how we as an audience can view. When it comes to how we're learning, a lot of times schools look to different instructional technology models. The SAMR model has been pretty familiar. Does anyone here use the SAMR model in their district? Okay, a couple hands. Has anyone heard of the SAMR model? It's your last day at FETC, so chances are you've probably heard it by now, at least. The SAMR model is a model that I think is helpful in terms of helping us as educators to think about what are our students doing, right? And it's not, I would challenge you to think about, it's not about thinking through the tools lens, it's thinking about what are kids doing. And I really like to break down this model when I present, along with when I work with my teachers at my own school, specifically through showing the different levels of SAMR and the different levels of what the use of technology means in our school by kind of just going through one app. There's an app called Subtext. Does anyone here use Subtext? Okay, a couple. Like I said, I just picked one, and I wanted to say, how can I show how technology can be used by students at different levels that can provide them with a different experience depending on how the teacher decides to implement it? Because we as teachers really can have a very powerful role in designing these learning experiences for our students in terms of how we're using technology. So at a very basic, simple level, and you'll learn more about Subtext as I go through how it can be used in different ways at different levels by students. Bottom line, Subtext is an app on the iPad where teachers can assign a text to either individual students, groups of students, and that's all I'm going to tell you for now. You'll get more later. So at the substitution level of the SAMR ML, we're just replacing an old technology with a new technology. There's no task change. There's no functional improvement. This would be me saying, okay, instead of looking at this primary source document in our history class, instead of reading it on paper and annotating it, I'd like you to read it on your iPad. No functional change, no instructional change, okay? Task is still the same. We're just replacing paper with an iPad. That's the lowest level. The next step is augmentation. This is where the technology allows us to augment that experience. We've probably all had an augmented experience, whether it's on our cell phones or whether it's using grammar check, spell check. That's where the technology provides a functional change. Your task is still the same, but there's a little functional change allotted by the technology. So for example, in Subtext, obviously you could highlight, annotate, ask questions, Google a term. If you look at the bottom, it'll actually pronounce a word for anyone accessing that text. So there's some functional changes, but I'm not really changing the task. Some of these things, yes, you could do on paper, but you'll see that there's added features that this technology allows to augment that student experience, but their task is still the same. So that's the augmentation level. And when things start to get really interesting is when technology allows us to do things that we never could have done before, or maybe never could have done as easily before. And we can change that student task. So at modification, the technology actually allows us as educators to change that learning experience in ways that we couldn't have really achieved before. So my example with Subtext here is something nice about Subtext is that kids can collaboratively explore a text together, as well as teachers can push out questions. And you have those interactive features, which are synchronous and asynchronous. You have two options. Specifically, I really wanted to start exploring Subtext last year. So I partnered with one of our tech specialists at one of our feeder schools. So we're 9-12, and they were 5th through 8, I believe. And actually, no, they had some younger grades. But we worked with their 5th grade class. I said, hey, Jimmy, I really want to explore Subtext. And he said, so do I. And we found, there was a social studies teacher, he said, who was really excited to collaborate and try new things. And it also happened that she was going to be out for a day. So we were able to design a learning experience based on what the content the kids were already working with, and go from there. So what we thought was interesting is the kids needed help with looking at deeper text comprehension. We wanted to support their thinking and reading skills. We wanted them to really have a more awareness in terms of how they were using those tools that good readers use. So specifically, we wanted to focus on the think aloud, read aloud strategies. And so if you're familiar with those, it's really finding a way to model what goes on in a reader's head as they're reading to get to that deeper comprehension, right? Because a lot of times we can say, oh, that person's they really get it, they're a good reader, they understand a lot, or they're smart, but we don't know all the work that's going on in their head to get to those outcomes, right? So what we thought is, wouldn't it be interesting to not only employ that strategy as we would in a traditional way, where we, as the teacher, modeled it, and then we had the kids say, what did Caroline, what did Ms. Habig do that helped her? So rereading, making connections, asking questions, connecting something I was reading to another text that we had read, all those types of things, to help our kids become more familiar with those behaviors. So then the next step was, how do we help our kids have that experience, and how do we leverage this technology to allow our students to do that? So the task for the kids was to use subtext. We put them in small groups. We said, here's the text you're going to read, and instead of doing your read aloud, we want you to use some of the comment spaces in the subtext text to explore your thinking. And then before we could even tell them the next step of where we wanted them to interact together on that text, they actually started asking each other questions and answering and got really excited. And just to give you a little familiarity with the access this class had, they're using iPads on carts. They don't take them home. It's just primarily school access, things like that. And the reason I'm telling you that is because when I show you the reflection video from the kids, it's really kind of interesting, the implications they're coming up with of what this technology feature could allow them to do even outside of class. So I want to share a video reflection with you about what these fifth graders thought of this whole learning experience. So remember, this is modification because now we're able to modify the experience students are having with text, with making thinking visible and audible, collaboration, because the technology is allowing us to do that, and specifically the implications it has for life beyond our time together in the classroom.
If you didn't know what something meant, someone could explain it for you. So, when you understand a book, it's a lot more fun to read it.
So, like what she said, instead of just putting a post-it note inside, you can actually show with the group because it's technology, and you could just interact with people. They can comment, and they can tell you your thoughts. Yes, you read books, and then you show what you think. That's how I think how subtext works.
It's helpful mostly so when you're at home, you can still communicate. Like a long-distance book club, but I mean, it's still helpful in class, but I think it would be more useful at home.
Yeah, it's a long-distance thing, but it depends. It's like you can use it anytime. Like if you're in class, sometimes you can talk to them about okay, I typed this down, and let's say they can just talk to you. But yes, if let's say you need help on a book or you're home, you could just type and say, hey, you guys, you know what this means, and then they can tell you.
So some of their reactions are just really interesting. They say it's like reading each other's minds. The things they're saying that they think they could do outside of school, saying it was really interesting to hear what they were saying about the value of their peers and how having that access in and outside of class to their peers was really, really interesting. So those are some of the different levels. And then at the highest level of the San Ramal redefinition, this is where we as educators have the ability to empower our students to do things that they never could have done before. So there's a couple examples that I'll give you here. Is one of my friends teaches fourth grade in Pennsylvania, and he has his kids using content creation apps to produce their own books. So they do their research, they produce their books, then they publish them in iTunes, and then what's really interesting there is because of that access and the ability of what they're able to create, they partner with other schools around the world, sharing peer-to-peer research, talking about the things they do, and the motivation level there is really interesting in terms of how students are finding a whole new meaning in the work they're doing. And he's able to do that because the technology that he's able to access allows him to leverage those types of experiences for students. Another thing that I forgot to put on this slide is if you're thinking about augmented reality, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on, is really when you have the ability to change how we merge the physical and digital spaces in which we learn and think. That's another possibility. I'll talk about some of the implications for student creation and then looking at how we curate that work, share that work, and build off that work. So I'm going to go back to this idea of why metacognition. Well, for us, it's really about learner engagement, supporting differentiation, and changing our views on formative assessment. I'm going to talk about how technology has really allowed us to have our students demonstrate, explain, and reflect in completely different ways. So for us, it's really about how does this technology allow our students to demonstrate, explain, and reflect in different ways. And how do we as educators design deeper reflective learning experiences? So traditionally, I'd say when we think of formative assessment and the role of technology, we are looking at the desired state of learning, okay, often modeled by the teacher. So where do the kids need to be, right? What do we want that outcome to be? And I'd say a lot of times technology has been seen as the solution for gathering the current state, which is good, right? But I would challenge you to think about how a lot of times, traditionally with formative assessment, it's about saying, okay, this group of kids is struggling here, this group has that. How do I, as the teacher, need to modify my instruction, okay? And yes, that is an important piece. But I would challenge you to think about how the technology and apps and possibilities that we have with the iPad actually can help us to rethink about this process of going from the current state of where kids are at to the desired state of learning, okay? So specifically, I would say content creation apps allow us to really kind of blow up this idea of student thinking. And more importantly, how do we get kids to be more aware of their own thinking and the gaps in their learning? And how do we help not only use that information to help us as teachers modify the learning experience, but how do we help kids become more aware of the gaps in their own thinking and then to problem solve around that? And I would say, and some of the stuff I'm going to share today is how we're using the iPad to really make that student thinking piece more explicit for students as well and involving them in their own learning process. I saw in the Google form many of you filled out, you said you're doing a lot of work with portfolios. I would also say that something to start to think about would be how can we leverage content creation apps to change, or not really change, but really to add to what those portfolio experiences look like. For us, technology really helps students to articulate the gaps in their thinking as well as the successes in their learning, and showing this idea of growth over time. I know a lot of times as teachers we look at our kids and we look at their growth over time or things they need to grow. But really, how do we involve kids more in that conversation? And that's been a very interesting piece in the work that we're doing at my school. So specifically, to develop this idea of growth over time, we're focusing on iPad creation apps and specifically thinking of creation through the lens of making student thinking visible and audible. And there's many apps that allow us to do that. It's how are we as educators designing those experiences. And that's why I like to talk about the SAMR model before we get into this, because there's many apps out there, right? But you could use them in ways that are either just substituting or augmenting or modifying or redefining the experience. And it's up to us as educators and teacher leaders to think about, well, how do I use those tools in a way that truly can transform that experience for our student? I want to show you a video clip of one of the interviews I did with one of our teachers last year. She was a first-year teacher at our school. She teaches fine arts, specifically theater. And so we did this project second semester where the kids had to, we basically redefined the lesson. So the original lesson was the kids would pick a fairy tale, they would do living pictures or tableaus in class of important scenes, and then they would have to talk about the specific vocabulary that they had to use. So position, facing. I'm not a theater teacher, but those are some of the key things that they talked about. And we wanted to say, okay, well, how do we help the kids to really think more about And for us to be able to truly understand, do all the kids in the class really get those key concepts? Are they going to be able to, where are they in relation to mastery of the learning target? Because as most of you, you've probably found out you can only be in one place at one time, and you probably have more students than you can hear and see altogether. So what we did with the technology was we had the kids do the performance task, so they still did the tableaus, but they took pictures. Then they brought those pictures of the different scenes into a comic maker app. And then after they did that and they left it blank, we had the kids post them on our learning management system, Haiku, which has a feature called Wiki Projects, where basically it's an empty website that you can assign to groups of kids, a whole class of kids, or individual kids, where kids can populate their work. So we had the different groups post these tableaus, you know, the pictures they took, they put in Comic Maker, these empty comics if you think about it. And then they had to go to a different groups and use the thought bubbles, the annotation features with bringing that image into the Comic Maker app again and say, you know, what did they think was going on? What was powerful? Giving feedback, things like that, and then posting it back for the group to see. So they're having then that outside experience. Then also they had to comment on, you know, what areas, what targets do they need to improve on? What were the strengths of the group? What were the strengths of the individuals doing this project? And Paul's going to talk more about, and what our kids often talk about, is how they really start to think more about what they're actually supposed to be learning instead of, okay, I did the action, okay, moving on, but really kind of slow that process down and then mix that up between in and outside of class time. So here's
the project that I'm working with right now is in my Acting 2 class, the Fairy Tale Tableau project, where I have broken the class up into groups of 4 or 5. They've chosen a fairy tale that they'd like to work with, and they've broken that fairy tale up into 5 specific moments that they're creating tableaus for. And tableau in French means a living picture. So they've chosen 5 moments of a fairy tale to portray the action of that fairy tale in the form of a tableau. So things that were gained by the addition of technology from a student perspective was definitely time to reflect, which is a huge part of the learning process, being able to actually look at the piece. So instead of having the moment of kids just up on stage and you're sort of stuck in that performance moment, to be able to actually capture that moment, to take more time to study the intended targets. So are they using their space? Are they incorporating shape, facing, and level, my specific learning targets for the content or for the unit? We're able to sort of capture those and make sure, zone in and look at that frozen moment and time and truly assess, are they reaching our targets in that technology? And the kids are excited to really get their hands in and get involved in the process of this project. They like to go in and they like to take the pictures and import them. And in this project, they're actually putting in word bubbles in the comics so they get to use their creative thought and bring in their own ideas about what's happening in the moment.
So that's her take on it. And as I go through the presentation today, I'm going to show you different examples of student work, different ways our teachers are taking an old lesson and redefining how the learner engages in that lesson to reach the learning targets in a new way. So that's just a little heads up on what's to come. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about some tips and strategies I use myself, as well as what I use when I work with teachers to help move their thinking about going from how a lesson is and what's working well to identifying, what possibilities does perhaps technology allow us to do to modify that experience for our students. And that mind shift is really huge. I want to start with a video. It's an Ellen video. I apologize if you've already seen it, but it is pretty funny.
So these are all real apps, and I downloaded these from iTunes. This first one is called Is It Dark Outside? It's an app. It uses GPS, and it's based on your location. It can tell you if it's dark outside. Let's find out. No, it is not. No. Before this, I had to call someone and ask them if it was dark. So this is really handy for me. All right, and this.
Okay, and then if you've seen this clip, you may have seen that she goes on to talk about the stapler that, it's your phone, it makes like noise, but it doesn't staple anything, or the taxi sign, instead of having to go like this, you just hold it up. Or now we'd say maybe Uber, I don't know. And so she talks about what she calls bad apps. And I know on different levels you could argue things good and bad, but what I really want you to think about is I don't know about you, but a lot of times when people come to me, they say, how do I make this technology fit? Or, Caroline, what's a bunch of science apps? What's a bunch of English apps? What's a bunch of social studies apps? And I say, let's back this up. To me, it's actually not about asking this question. More importantly, it's about building a different mindset. Okay, so we need, I would say, to really make things more powerful, and I actually would argue it's a little easier, that we need to think about what our learners are learning now. Where do they need to get to, right? So take the technology piece out, say, okay, what do they need to be able to do? And then I say it's important to talk about what's going well, because chances are you're doing things that are working, right? Probably, yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, I'm just trying, I appreciate it. I'm sorry. You're like, man, lady, come on. It's the last day. But it is the morning. So really, what's going well? And then I like to talk about with my teachers, what do you want to do that maybe is challenging? So maybe it's being in one place more, or in many places at one time. Maybe it's how do I get the kids to think more about what they're doing? So then we start with that and problem solve off of that, and then we start to talk about technology. And that's a challenging, that's a challenge for people, I think, to gain that kind of mindset, because I think we are very used to looking at technology through a tools lens. I know that's something really that we're trying to change, I'm trying to change, and we're trying to change in where I work. And because we didn't have anyone really, we didn't have my position until 2.5 years ago. I mean, we always had tech support, we still have tech trainers, but this whole idea of how do we think about technology and learning, I think is challenging. So one thing I'm always trying to think of different ways, whether it's through our newsletter, whether it's through videos of how do I help my teachers get through that thinking, because it's this thinking process that's going to help them when I'm not there, right? Because there's also only one of me, and we have 500 adult learners in our district building, or 2 connected buildings. So here's an example of a video. I made it using the app Video Scribe on the iPad, and I just like to think of what are some quick ways that I can constantly try to get these messages out. And it'll also show you, what is our process of thinking when we use technology.
Developing innovation is a cognitive process. We have to start by asking what works for learners now. What are we doing well? It's also important to remember that we must ask, what would we like to do that we aren't able to do currently? Don't forget to ask what thinking behaviors learners need to gain. We always recommend starting simple. Start by choosing one instructional practice or learning behavior that you want to focus on. And now we can consider technology.
So really, it's about asking those questions and reminding ourselves as teachers that that should be the focus of our thinking. So what are kids doing well? What works for learners now? So taking your experiences of what works. And then what would we like to see or do? And then starting with one thing, what learning behaviors do kids need to gain? And really starting simple. I think a lot of times technology can be very overwhelming for people, or at least in my school it is. And how can we really break things down to be more accessible? So as I was starting to talk about this, I was actually at the Apple Distinguished Educator Institute this last summer, and long story short, I'm also a cyclist, and I was getting ready for our state competition, which was the week after I got back. So I convinced a couple other ADEs to rent some bicycles, and we would train. So training often leads to having to do more laundry. And So then there was another AD who I had just met from Switzerland named Mark, and I convinced him to go do laundry with me. And as we were waiting for our laundry, we were talking about how we really wanted to provide a professional learning resource for our teachers that would help them experience our technology as a learner, as well as build their skills as a teacher. So together, and I have to tell the laundry story because otherwise our little handle doesn't make any sense at all. We joined forces, and he calls us M Laundrette, and we've designed iTunes U courses that are focused on developing leaders and redefining mobile learning. So we work with teachers in our schools and people outside of our schools who want to experience any of these resources about how we help teachers to engage in learning about new technologies, specifically content creation, but then also provide performance tasks and challenges that help teachers to actually engage in that work to show their own learning. Right now our course is it's private because we have the discussion feature, so his teachers in Switzerland and mine in the Chicago area can see each other's work. But if anyone's interested in that later, I'd be happy to add you to that course. The thing in iTunes U is if you have discussions, it has to be private. We also have some work that we did on visible thinking, and the iPad that was selected is one of the ADE iTunes courses that is on its way to being published right now. So that'll be out there. And for us, it's really about how do we create an environment where we can extend the circle for our teacher learners as well. If you haven't checked out the Apple Distinguished Educators 1 Best Things in the iBook store, that's another great resource. Basically, and some of these are also incorporated in our iTunes U course, but basically 2 years ago at the Apple Distinguished Educator Institute, they challenged ADs to say, what's your one best thing? And then tell that story, produce those resources, make it accessible to other educators out there. And then the ones they vetted and Apple thought was most valuable were published in the One Best Thing collection. So there's a lot of really neat resources there. If you're like, I work with teachers and I want to show them new things, or I'm a teacher and I want to explore what's relevant in my classroom, those are a lot of really great free resources to check out. And another thing to know is my fellow ADs, they're really, really excited about this stuff. And I would totally encourage you to reach out to them on Twitter or other networks, and they'll definitely want to talk to you about this work or help you or answer questions. I know we've brought people in via FaceTime to talk to groups of teachers, and I just want to say that that's a really interesting group of people who are really excited about the work we're doing and happy to help you. So it's really about moving away from how do I make technology fit and building a deeper experience. So I'm going to talk more about some student examples. And like I say, I often want people to think about how there's many different tasks that we want kids to be able to do or thinking we want them to be able to demonstrate that transcend our content, right? Yeah. I would say no matter what grade level we teach in here, we actually probably have a lot of similarities in the things we want our teachers to be able to achieve. So I'm going to talk about some specific examples, but there's a lot of similarities in terms of that teacher objective, not the content objective per se, but the teacher objective. So this whole higher order thinking, metacognition. I'm going to start with some work that one of our science teachers, Christina Wood, she teaches anatomy and physiology and some biology. And she was really trying to explore how can the iPad provide students with a different experience. So traditionally, the kids do this thing she calls the bead activity. And let me actually back up one thing before that. Our whole science department of 50 teachers is rewriting their curriculum to fit the next generation science standards. Okay, and so part of that is moving away from looking at content, much like Common Core, right, and focusing on these bigger skills that kids can have that are transferable. So conducting investigations, analyzing data, using models, constructing explanations of what they're seeing, and then communicating. So for her, it's about how do we help build these skills. And they had an activity that some of her team, the teachers, decided to just do it traditionally, and then there were some teachers who decided to modify it and use the iPad. So I'm going to talk about what they did. So with the bead activity, basically the kids they're working on their skills of experimentation. They're given one of these little beads, and their job was to go home, select a household liquid, something school appropriate, and with high school you always have to throw that in there, or you never know what you're going to get. And they had to make a prediction about if that bead was going to change. It's the type of bead you put in like a flower arrangement, it holds water, and they had to make predictions about changes in size in the bead. They had to record the values and then create a working claim, right, about what changes might occur, what's going to occur. And they had to photograph the bead several different times. Initially, then after 1 hour, and then after overnight of being in whatever liquid they decided to put it in. And so normally, without the technology, obviously they're not taking the picture, but they're looking, they're describing, they're writing, that part's the same.
Start your explain everything by giving it a title.
So the
Don't forget to
directions,
include
she
the main
sped
date
it
of
up.
the bead. Your next slide should give the initial size of the bead. Include a prediction. What did you think would happen to the bead? Use the graphic provided by your teacher to describe what you did in your experiment. It's important to provide evidence to either support or refute your claim.
So it's
Your
about the
last piece of
support.
evidence will be the measurement of the bead the next day. Finish your explain everything by explaining everything. What do you think happened? You can add arrows to your diagram. You can add labels. Try to use scientific terminology to describe what happened. This should be the most detailed part of your explain everything. Try and create a model to describe the events that occurred. Keep the entire project under a minute, but feel free to add any creative elements you like.
Okay, so that's just like the quick summary that the teacher does to be able to see this is what you're doing for this assignment. So in her class, they're taking the photographs, and the next day the kids came back and in class, and you can modify where kids do these things depending on your schedule. But the kids then in class used Explain Everything to go through specifically encouraging kids to talk about their claims, talking about evidence, using key vocabulary, what the big thing she was trying to get the kids to do in their projects. And then they would share them, they would export them into Google Drive, share their link, and then she had a Google form where the kids would put their link so it's easy to assess, and then she could provide feedback. And then eventually, further down the road, kids are able to create review resources. And that's another thing I'm going to talk about as I go through different examples here. So one thing that was really unique is that the kids also looked at each other's projects and then talked about what did they do well, what did they need to improve on, specifically looking at supporting a claim, making a claim, providing evidence, using key vocabulary, and if they weren't sure what was good or needed improvement, the teacher showed clips of student examples. And specifically, what she found is that these student projects, and like you're going to see in some of the other work I show, are that kids who maybe we don't know if they quite get it or they don't talk a lot in class, is really where they're starting to see them shine. So she actually picked work of struggling students that were doing really well and to show some of their work. I think I'll show you some of their examples next.
Hi, this is the bead lab. My name is Daniel West, and I will be using orange juice with pulp to cover the bead. I feel that the orange juice will get absorbed while leaving the pulp behind because the pulp is too big to be absorbed.
I soaked the bead in Minute Maid Light Lemonade, which is shown on the bottom right-hand corner. The bead after 1 hour was measured at 0.23 inches, 0.58 centimeters. Also, I believe the water had an effect on the growth. Just like a sponge, the bead absorbed the water, making it expand. For my liquid, I chose Gatorade, which is flavored Glacier Freeze. I chose to use this liquid because I wanted to see if the drink could change its size and possibly the color of the bead. From measuring my bead, it was then 3.5 millimeters, and I started to see small growth and a slight color change as I predicted. And after an hour, the measurement turned out to be 0.58 centimeters on this bead, which is a pretty big difference from before. This shows that the bead grew 3.8 millimeters while in the apple juice for an hour, which supports my claim that the bead grew inside. The bead was placed in water. overnight, as the bead soaked in water, it grew to about 1.8 centimeters. The bead's initial length was about right there, where that purple dot is, and it grew to about where that red circle is. The water was absorbed to about this line, so the water level decreased because the bead absorbed the water. The reason the bead increased in size all comes down to a process called osmosis. This is where the molecules from areas of high concentration move to areas of low concentration to try to equalize the concentrations. In this case, the H2O molecules would move into the bead to try to equalize the concentration of the bead in the water.
This, you can see, is the pulp, the excess of the orange juice, meaning that the bulb did not absorb the orange juice. So this was a no-go.
So as you can see, kids are giving in-depth explanations, they're showing their work, they're actually having to think more about this process. And one thing that the teachers found when they compared the results of the kids and the learning and the other assessments that are put in place with these skills, right, not just about beads, but about the skills, that when kids were asked to do their work through this method, where we found that they were more intentional, that they had better understanding and retention of the concepts, they were able to apply them, I can't even talk, in later learning experiences and assessments. So we really found that it was a way to help our students think more about the process of their learning. She also had the kids discussing the elements of what they need for a convincing presentation. So after they watched each other's some examples, they talked about, what was more convincing. And I'm sure you even saw in some of those quick snippets of student work how some seemed a little more in depth. Some were like, ooh, that was a little more in depth, or maybe a little more impressive, or why was that more convincing? So getting kids to be more aware of those skills in terms of creating a presentation. I'm going to talk about assessment a little more later on today, but one of the big things to say now is looking at how she had the kids talk about what would be a good thing for criteria before they did their projects, and then also later providing with clear mechanisms for feedback and report as well. So how to do it, some key things. And these first few things are going to sound like common sense, but they're important, I think, to remind ourselves. First of all, I like to talk about instructional moves, where the things good teachers do, but we don't always write down in lesson plans, like gauging student readiness, providing clear directions, and how do we provide that feedback piece, okay? Visible thinking, there's a lot of apps out there. Once again, it's not about the tools, but it's about the features of the tools that allow kids to do different things. And these are just some, and I'm going to show you some examples of apps that at different grade levels we're using to make thinking visible and audible. And I'm even going to talk about how Puppet Pals, has anyone heard of Puppet Pals? It's been around a long time. How we've actually used it, and how I used it in AP Psychology. And it's not just for young kids telling stories about dragons, frogs, and squirrels. So, for example, a lot of these apps, I think, have features that allow students to take something that's abstract and communicate it in concrete ways. So, for example, when I was teaching AP Psychology, this idea of neurotransmission, how a neuron fires, right? And that's something my kids struggled with. It's a process they would need to know for not just Chapter 2, but also how they're going to apply it in ways and be ready for the AP exam. So I made a model, and then I had the kids use apps even such as Puppet Pals. So this is with Puppet Pals to show how a neuron fires. I'm just going to show you a little clip about how an app that people often think is just for little kids telling stories can be used.
The charge inside the cell when it's not firing is negative. And when then the cell is depolarized, meaning the positive ions outnumber the negative, the charge is positive. When the charge goes from negative to positive, you've reached the threshold, and the cell depolarizes. When the cell depolarizes, a brief electrical charge travels down the axon, away, all the way to the axon terminals, where the neurotransmitters are stored, which are the chemical messengers. Those neurotransmitters are then released.
Okay, then they're released and talks more. But you get the idea. Basically, it's really about challenging our kids to think through these processes, because we all know as educators, if you can explain something and teach something, you know it pretty well, or you get to know it pretty well. So a lot of times it's helping kids think through activities like this, and then helping them know how to transfer those skills in other ways to other performance tasks that they may have to do. So like I said, it's really about thinking about the features. I'm going to show another high school example and then an elementary example with Explain Everything. And I want you to pay attention to some of the features in these apps, which once again can allow us to change that experience, right, for the learner. So in our PE classes, they're relatively big. We have like 40 freshman boys next to another class of 40 freshman boys or girls, all in the gym. And so it can be chaotic at times. Another goal of our physical welfare department is to get kids thinking beyond just, say, basketball drills or soccer rules or football rules, things like that, but to think more about lifelong health and fitness. And so I've been working with some of our teachers to design activities where we take, once again, the targets the kids have to know, along with these skills that they have to do and the physical activity they have to do to look at that overall learning. So I'm going to show you this example that we did in PE, but I want you to also pay attention to some of the features, because those I think are what are going to help you make maybe some meaning of what your kids can do with these types of tools.
Hi, I'm Mike Komarovsky, and this is my basketball drill presentation. When dribbling, one should remember to keep their eyes up, knees bent, and ball low and close. I need to keep my eyes up and bend my knees more, as shown in this diagram. When passing, one should remember to take only one step after catching the ball, pass straight across on the chest pass, and bounce the ball in the middle on a bounce pass. I should remember to bounce the ball more towards the middle. Can basketball be a good exercise for lifelong fitness? In the idea of cardio, basketball involves running, but one would have to run back and forth across the court to get the benefit of the cardio. Muscles. Leg and arm muscles are used for running, passing, and shooting. This does help keep one in shape. The question comes up, how often and intense does one need to play basketball in order to get the full benefit? To get the full benefit, one would have to play quite often at a good intensity, where they are running back and forth across the court. There are a few strengths and limitations. Basketball helps with cardio and muscles, but it can be very tiring. And 5, aging. As one ages, it can become difficult to play basketball because of the amount of running involved.
I think the teacher must have said something about aging, because as I was looking through all these examples, and they're like, aging could be a problem. It's like, Michael, you could have said something about swimming or low-impact sports, but I'm not here to judge Michael. But you get the idea of some of the features. You can bring video in, you can bring picture in, you can take the video down, or the sound down from a video if you want to record over it. Features like that are what you can use. I think it's important to show a first grade example. One, Explain Everything. Yes, thank you. So my mom is an elementary school instructional coach, and we were talking about how they could use technology in some of their classrooms. But, so we started with a first grade lesson where the kids are learning about motion, balance, weight, counterweight. Those are the key vocabulary that they have to use. Once again, doing investigations, just like we kind of saw in the science video in high school. Skills are so necessary across the gamut here. And so the kids started with doing with the paper manipulatives like they normally would do in class, so to do their physical investigation. And then afterwards, they had the kids use Explain Everything to show that thinking. Okay. And as you watch this, I want you to think about, because the kids are able to produce these types of artifacts, what are things we as teachers can start to do differently? Remember, she's 6 years old.
I'm Annie, and I did an investigation of balance and motion, and this one can't balance because those two aren't below. The two counterweights aren't where the balance point should be, and it's not stable when you balance it. And for with the next one, it's balanced because these two counterweights are even and they're below where the balance point should be. And when you balance it, it's stable. And for this one, it can balance because these two are really even and they're below the balance point. And if you balance it, it can be stable. And for the last one, these two can't balance because they're not even. And the little part is below, but it still can't balance because the balance point is way here. And when you balance it, it's not stable. And that's what I learned.
So what are some implications of things we can do with these types of products? Okay, so modeling the use of vocabulary, having the kid be more aware of it. What else? So assessing kids' work, having review resources, so if you think about age. And I would also say, especially at this level, a lot of times I think all parents want to help their kids, but they may not always know how. So we're also looking at how do we leverage student-created work to help parents to support their learners at home. And that's a really interesting piece. I'm going to skip a few slides here. One other big thing I want you to think about today is that, many of the apps all work together within the iPad. So like I told you with the comic maker example, the camera is so powerful. And I briefly want to talk about some examples with Book Creator. We're using it at my high school to have kids really become more in depth with the work they're doing, as well as I have friends in the elementary realm who are having kids show their work and do research in very dynamic ways using Book Creator. Sketch is another great app. You can get on any device, really, computer, Apple, Android, anything. I'm going to talk about it. I'll get to it. I apologize. I'm a little short on time. So current events. I'm working with, yes? Yes. Sketch is free. Did I fail to mention that's a really great thing about it? Yeah. It works on so many ways. I actually had an activity that I was going to ask us to do, but I don't think we're going to get to it, but I will show you quick snippets of what we're going to do because it takes Sketch and put it with visible thinking strategies, and you can have a really powerful experience. So first of all, I'm going to talk about one of our social studies teachers, Ms. Stone. She works on a lot of things. She also has a great sense of humor. She first came to me saying, I want to find a way to have the kids use the iPad. And if we can put their textbook on the iPad, that means we're using technology. Cross it off our list, right? We're done. And I said, well, okay, we can explore the textbooks. That's, there could be some good things. So we have to see what the app actually offers you. Does it augment the experience? Is it just, reading a PDF? What is it? But I challenged her to think about, let's step away from that conversation for a moment. What are your kids doing now where they struggle? And she teaches U.S. history where our kids are juniors in that class. And she said they struggle with understanding the key concepts. They have a hard time being motivated, all that thing. So we took her traditional assignment where the kids are going to have to break down the essay and talk about the progressive era movement, right? They had to talk about life before the reform, after the reform, what the reform did, was it social, political, economic, and how did it impact democracy. So to help the kids think more strategically and make more sense of those progressive era movements, we had them answer those questions while also using Book Creator, which is a great app, I think, for across all grade levels. Basically, we gave the kids very clear directions. They had to choose one reform movement, and then we broke down those key components into pages. So being very specific. This page talks about this page talks about that, but how you do it on your page is up to you. So we modeled some examples. So I convinced one of my friends who I used to teach social studies with, now she's the elementary school librarian, some of the features. So when we went through and showed the kids the features, like you can add photos, you can draw from other apps it would send to the camera roll, obviously, whether it's video or photo, you can embed them here, you can record sound. we wanted to show them how these features could be used for them to really kind of show their own understanding in new ways. So really, we did an example of, instead of just saying what life was like before the reform, we created a piece of historical fiction. So I pretended to be one of the mill girls working in the factories. And we played these examples, and showing the kids these examples is not only a good way for teachers to get familiar with the tools, but inspires the kids to think about how they could actually show their learning in different ways. And we gave the kids pretty much free rein on different apps they could use to explain that information. We also showed them apps like Paper 53. Those of you who like to draw or who are into art or sketchnoting, Paper 53 is a really neat app. We showed them how they could bring in other apps and hyperlinks, so if they did edu-creation videos, how they could bring them into their book. And some things that were really exciting was to see how the kids were responding. Another thing that I would encourage, and then we're going to wrap up and show you Sketch. Another thing that I would encourage is having checkpoints. I said to the teacher, why don't we, as they're going through this process, let's send them a form where they fill out their information so we can check content-wise, do they get it? But then we also included questions of how will you show? Okay, so what is the information, so we could check their content understanding, but then also see how were they thinking in terms of the creativity aspect. And we created a rubric, and I'd be happy to share this. If you want to email me or tweet me, I'd be happy to send this to you, to really help the kids think through the criteria. Once again, that assessment piece is so huge. So when the kids turned them in, they turned them in through Google Drive. We actually had a form that they had to fill out reflection-wise, and then also give us their file. But because of Yosemite, we were actually able to access the kids' products on our Mac computers as well as on the iPad. So for teachers going through work, thinking about that workflow, there's some nice features that way. And a lot of our kids, they really, and remember, this is a class where we have a wide range of abilities. We have kids who are struggling learners, as well as people who are proficient, but they talked a lot about how they gained a deeper understanding of the content. They enjoyed the ability to express creativity and freedom, to show their learning in new ways. We saw kids who have different disabilities feel empowered and to use even the recording features. So it was really fascinating to see. If you want more examples, I have put together a multi-touch book you can get for free in the iTunes bookstore, where we have all different lessons, the plans, the links, student reflections, teacher reflections in there. So that's something if you want to see more student examples. We have Redefining Learning. It's called Transforming the Process and Product. Okay, so there's a lot of lessons there. And then professional learning, talk about that later. Assessment, if you haven't heard of the Buck Institute for Education, they have a lot of really great resources for content and process. Rubrics you can edit. And then I want to flip real quick, I'm sorry. Augmented reality, we're going to skip for now. Okay, so Sketch. Activity, I do want to show you this because you can easily take it back to your own classroom, and as the gentleman said in the back, it's free and works on any device really. So today, the thing I was going to have you do that you can do in your own classroom is after today's presentation, after all this information and examples, what's something you see, think, and wonder. Okay, so it's a visible thinking strategy. Using the app Sketch, and I had people do this. I was in an administrator conference in South Africa in September, and I actually got a whole room of heads of schools to do this. I was quite surprised. First of all, you start by snapping a photo. So I say snap a photo of yourself or something that exemplifies you if you don't like your face on a photo. Mark it up and send it. So with Sketch, you take the picture. There's all different annotation tools. You can use arrows. You can change colors. And then, so as you can see, I did the I think, I see, I wonder, okay, which is what I was going to try to convince people here to do. And then you can either connect it to Evernote, you can send it out through mail, you can save it in another app, photos, stuff like that. You can message it. And, okay, so that was going to be your time, or tweet it out. So Sketch actually has been a really simple tool, free tool, that you can employ a lot of these good practices with to get the kids making their learning visible and share it in new ways. So if you want to get adventurous and try Sketch, feel free to get the app, snap a photo, and then use the tools to say what you think, see, and wonder. And then I was going to have us, you can send it to @Habig, and then use the conference hashtag I thought would be kind of fun. Yes? I would say most of the things I showed today were explain everything, but they may have done something in Sketch that they then brought in to explain everything to manipulate. And book creator and comic maker, really this whole idea of app layering, right? Like how do you capture something going on in one app, often the camera roll, or an app that works with the camera, and then exports it, and then putting them together. If anyone wants to talk more about this later, I'd be happy to talk with you here or phone or hangout or email. Because there's a lot of neat ways we can connect the features of many apps. So, or you can email it if you're not on Twitter. So if there's anything else, I'd be happy to answer questions. Yes?
You had a slide about app layering.
Yes.
And you got it down just before I got it.
Sorry.
That's okay. So you said take pictures, app, push camera roll, open telegami.
That's one example. Telegami, you can use the different features to create a video they're like 1-minute avatar videos, and then kids are putting those either in book creator and making books. If you don't want someone's face there, that's a good app to use. Although it has a 1-minute limit, so that's something to remember. Stuff like that. What else was I going to tell you? Oh. If you're in augmented reality, using your camera or any videos are neat ways to have a trigger image and then provide examples. So here's something, one of my friends who teaches in elementary, there's specific either books they read or their textbook. You'll often notice that the first page of a textbook chapter is it's more visual than like maybe other pieces of it. So what he does is he uses it as a trigger image, and then he'll have a little video, sometimes using Telegami, telling the kids to think about certain reading strategies or things to think about in that chapter. If you're older level, this is another way to maybe incorporate student work to really kind of bring it to life. So those are other examples of how you use an app to create something, do something, and then what's it mean afterwards, right? So that's another connection I usually talk about. So. Do I have a handout? I will get these up on the presenter website, and I also have a lot of the things in the multi-touch book are going to give you a lot of really good examples. It has a lesson plan, student examples, the directions we gave kids, kid reflection, teacher reflection, rubrics. And if you ever want to contact me, I'd be happy to help you out with whatever. The iTunes bookstore. So if you go to iBooks store, search my last name, and you'll see it there. Oh, yeah, the Buck Institute for Education. That has a lot of really great rubrics and assessment resources for inquiry and project-based learning. Or the multi-touch book with the lesson plans. Thank you. I didn't want to say the wrong thing. Redefining learning, rethinking the process and product of student work, student creation. So, thank you for coming.